So, David, thank you for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this seminar series. I'm very honored, and I am pleased to talk about our work in reinforcement learning over the years. Let me begin by explaining this title that I chose. Um, the basic idea of reinforcement learning goes back very far. It's a common sense notion that we learn from the consequences of our behavior. You know, if we succeed or if we fail, we learn from that. We learn from rewards. We learn from penalties, and that certainly is a common sense view of a certain kind of learning that goes back very far. And yet, more recently, reinforcement learning, or at least computational reinforcement learning, as I call it, is playing a large role in AI systems and is receiving a lot of attention these days. I have to preface this by saying that I'm not going to be able to talk about the cutting edge of reinforcement learning research. In fact, I don't even know where that cutting edge is. I've been retired for more than 10 years, and it's impossible to keep up with the pace of advancements, uh, not just for me, but for young people as well. So keep that in mind. And this will be a bit heavy on history, which I know the most about. Uh, and let me begin by saying that one of the facets of this work that has interested me the most is the connections to various other disciplines. And I make no claims to be a psychologist or a neuroscientist or a control theorist, but these connections have been very striking as they emerged over the years. And to me, that's sort of the major thing that kept me interested in this field for so long. So I'm going to try to lay out some of these connections and explain what I think is interesting about them. So let's begin with a concrete idea of reinforcement learning due to Edward Thorndike. And he studied animals uh, in puzzle boxes. A cat put in the box essentially randomly discovers a way out. There's food outside that it's motivated by, and lets itself out. Thorndike would put it back in the puzzle box and record how long it took the cat to get out the next time, and this time decreased over multiple trials until eventually the cat would let itself out immediately. This is what's known as learning by trial and error. And he did this with fish also. Different box, of course, but the idea of trial and error learning. This has been analyzed and criticized a lot throughout the years. But this is a statement from Thorndike of what he called the law of effect. And you can see from this that basically uh, it talks about connecting behavior if it's followed by satisfaction, or disconnecting if it's followed by discomfort. One of the main criticisms of this is the symmetry that it expresses between satisfaction and discomfort. But I'm going to ignore that for now and just emphasize that it's really a connectionist specification that talks about more firmly connecting behavior with a situation, or weakening connections with a situation. So that's an important element of the law of effect. So trial and error learning. Later, the basic procedure became known as instrumental or operant conditioning. Um, so to me, this is the basis of reinforcement learning. And although I said it has received a lot of criticism over the years, Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, wrote an article called Why the Law of Effect Will Not Go Away. And it has stayed around all of these years and is still, to me, the basic idea of reinforcement learning. Now, let's see, I need to move that. Okay. Um, to me, put in more computational terms, the basic idea is is a collection of control, search, and associative memory. So control is the process of influencing what future inputs the agent receives. Search is trial and error, generate and test, variation and selection, whatever terms you prefer. And memory is to remember what worked best in each situation and start from there the next time. So, oh, my slides are, no, there we go. Um, so reinforcement learning to me is about caching search results. So you don't have to keep searching. So this is the computer science view of this process. And the term has been offered called memoization. It's not memorization, but memoization, which really means if there's a process that's repeated, um, you don't need to do the computation again. You can extract the results, bypassing the computation to save computational time. And so in some sense, reinforcement learning to me is memoized contextual search. So it's not just search, but it's connecting to a context and memoizing so that it doesn't have to be repeated over and over again. Um, Now, another point is that the generator and the tester should both be smart in some way. So I'm not going to talk about that too much, but that's a underlying key factor as well. Now, putting this in kind of engineering terms, this is a control loop with an agent, a reinforcement learning agent interacting with an environment, generating actions, receiving rewards and state information from the environment, and formalizing this as a sequential process, in particular, a Markov decision process, which is shown at the bottom of this slide. So there's a sequence of states are uh, that appear over time, and actions generate or at least modulate the transition probabilities. And then there's a reward process that goes along with this as well. So it's a controlled Markov chain uh, with a reward process. And this is a formalism that many have adopted just because it's simpler in many ways than a continuous time uh, control framework, and it serves to illustrate the points um, in a clearer way, I think, than a continuous system. But these ideas extend to continuous time systems as well. Now, a key thing is the idea of a return, which really comes from financial applications. And a return is the sum, possibly discounted, of future rewards. And so the discount rate really controls whether the goals are short-sighted for immediate reward or whether as gamma approaches 1 become uh, where long-term accumulation of reward becomes important. So we'll see this idea again, but a key thing is that it's not just about immediate reward, but in many cases, the consequences of behavior don't appear for considerable amount of time. Now, to put this in machine learning terms, let me just quickly describe a couple of some of these basic paradigms of machine learning. One is supervised learning, which is learning from labeled examples, sometimes called learning with a teacher. And it's an error signal is created, which is the difference between the label and what the system actually produced as output. And the learning process is one of trying to minimize these errors over time. So this is error correction learning used for many different applications: regression, classification, imitation learning, prediction, system identification. It's actually the basic process that's used with large language models, which are learning to predict the next token or the next word in the utterance. So supervised learning is learning from labeled examples, and the labels can come from human experts, they can come from observing the world, or other means, but the key thing is that labeled examples are key to doing an error correction process. There's unsupervised learning, which is learning from unlabeled examples, or sometimes called learning without a teacher. And an example is clustering, where the labels are not externally provided, but clusters are formed based on similarity and differences between examples. Now, reinforcement learning is different than both of those. It's learning based on evaluations, rewards or penalties, for example. So the RL system receives evaluations, not examples. And the learning is directed to increase the amount of reward and decrease the amount of penalty, for example. Sometimes this is called learning with a critic. And it's key to understand that what's meant by a critic and how that's different than the so-called teacher of supervised learning is that the critic does not need to know what the desired responses are. Uh, so the critic can be less knowledgeable than a teacher in a supervised system. And this, to me, is a strength of reinforcement learning. The environment does not need to know as much as it would need to know to provide labeled examples. Um, and again, this process has been called learning by trial and error. And it's important to note that trial and error, as it's been used traditionally, is not the same as error correction. And this is a confusion that I've seen in many places, even among people who really study these algorithms. Error correction and trial and error are different. In fact, trial and error is not really, it's kind of a misleading use of words. It really should be trial and evaluation rather than trial and error. So that's a key thing that I think over the years, we've come to appreciate the importance of this distinction and noted the places in the literature where these are confounded. Now, quickly, I can't explain this whole picture, but one shouldn't equate an RL agent with a whole organism or robot. It's really considered something internal to the organism or the robot. So there's an internal environment, which is actually what's providing reward signals. And there's an external environment. So this is another conflation that I think should be avoided. An RL agent is not a whole behaving, I use the term organism, robot, doesn't matter, but this figure is an attempt to illustrate that the RL agent is really part of the larger organism, not the whole thing. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, there have been many applications of RL. Board games, maybe these are the best known: backgammon, Go, chess, poker, Stratego. Um, Amazing success in performing at a very high level in these games. Video games, Atari, Statecraft, Dota 2, Gran Turismo. Robotics, RL is used to train robot behavior. Um, Energy management, self-driving cars. RL is used to adjust the driving algorithms for so-called autonomous cars. I put it in quotes because they're not really autonomous yet, but people are working on that. Trading and finance, in fact, a lot of the basic formalisms come from that field. Natural language processing, healthcare. There are applications in healthcare, for example, fine-tuning chemotherapy schedules. And this is a sequential problem. So that's a key thing. RL is applicable to making decisions in sequences where the consequences of each decision needs to be incorporated in the next decision, as in a long-term therapy schedule. Then I mentioned at the end fine-tuning large language models. RL is used to try to improve the performance of these systems to prevent them from doing unwanted things. And I'm not an expert in all the applications of RL to large language models, but I think this is a growing field. RL is used to create reasoning for large language model systems. And it's just a field that I have not attempted to keep up with. It's just moves too quickly. Okay, so deep reinforcement learning is a term that is being used, which basically means RL combined with deep neural networks. So in all of these learning schemes, if what is to be learned is parameterized, then these learning systems adjust the parameters. And in the case of using deep neural networks, the function implemented by the system is represented as a deep neural network whose synaptic weights are adjusted by a learning algorithm, whether it's supervised learning or reinforcement learning. Basically, the same backpropagation process is used to adjust the parameters of a network. So that's what's being called deep reinforcement learning. Now, I want to mention a bit how I got involved in this, and that is I was a postdoc on a project called Goal-Seeking Components for Adaptive Intelligence, and this was to PIs at the University of Massachusetts, and it was based on this idea of Harry Clough, who was a physiologist who worked for the Air Force Avionics Directorate at the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And he had published a book called The Hedonistic Neuron. And his idea was that neurons are individually hedonists that work to maximize some analog of pleasure while minimizing some local analog of pain. And he had put forward this theory, and the Air Force produced this project to see if this made any sense. Was this crazy, or was this worth pursuing? And I became a postdoc on this project. Clough's idea also, he felt that homeostasis was not the major goal of living systems, but rather the goal was to maximize something, whereas homeostasis is to achieve equilibrium. He felt that living things don't have that as a primary goal. And so that was underlying his theory of the hedonistic neuron. And in fact, he proposed that the changes in synaptic efficacies followed the law of effect. Basically, when a neuron fires, all the synapses that were active in contributing to the action potential become eligible to change their efficacies. And then if the action potentials followed with an appropriate time period by an increase in reward, however that is implemented, the efficacies of all the eligible synapses increase or decrease in the case of punishment. So in effect, he argued that synaptic plasticity implements the law of effect. And synaptic eligibility is a key idea. So synapses become eligible. Their efficacies don't change, but they become eligible for change. And there are two kinds, at least two kinds of eligibility. One is contingent eligibility, which depends on the pre and postsynaptic activity of the neuron, leading to a three-factor learning rule: presynaptic, postsynaptic, and then a later reward or penalty. Whereas a non-contingent eligibility is triggered only by presynaptic activity, leading to a two-factor rule. So these graphs are my sketches showing first contingent, and you can see the spikes if there's a presynaptic and a postsynaptic, and I show no delay between them just to make it simple. The eligibility shown at the bottom increases and peaks at a certain time after, excuse me, so that's contingent on activity of the output activity, whereas if this works, this shows a non-contingent, so just presynaptic activity triggers eligibility. And I mention this because it's a key distinction between different learning rules. Okay, now a little bit of history, or a little more bit of history. I gave a talk a while ago called "In the Beginning, Machine Learning was Reinforcement Learning." And so even before computers existed, this shows a 1935 work by Stephen Smith at the University of Washington in psychology. The so-called mechanical rat finds its way in a maze by trial and error. And he said that it remembers what it learned far better than any man or animal. No living organism can be depended upon to make no errors of this type after one trial, although his reinforcement learning mechanical device apparently was able to do that. So this predates computers, for example, and actually the earliest proposal for doing reinforcement learning with a computer was by Alan Turing. In 1948, he described what he called a pleasure-pain system, learning system, and describing it in these words. And, a specific implementation of basically what would have been the law of effect. He didn't implement this, went on to other things. The computer that he would have implemented on was not available at the time. But this is a clear description of a kind of law of effect for implementing this with a digital computer. And then Claude Shannon, certainly well known for information theory, he created a mouse he called Theseus, and it ran a maze and remembered what moves worked and what didn't. Actually, the maze was learning, not the rat, but it was essentially the same thing. So he appeared on TV with this, and this was in the very early 50s. And then the first simulation of a artificial neural network learning on a digital computer was a paper by Farley and Clark. And whoops, and the date, I should have had the date here. I can't see it, but this was a neural network, and it was trained, and the objective was to make the activation of one group of units higher than another group, depending on their input pattern. So it was and it used a so-called proficiency measure. And then these units learned according to a simple reinforcement learning scheme. And it worked. And although, it was 64 stochastic linear threshold units, the stochasticity was quite important because the search or generate and test variation in selection was implemented by means of randomness in these neuron-like linear threshold units. And it's kind of amazing that his machine was 4K of magnetic core memory. So quite interesting. I think the first implementation of an adaptive neural network on a digital computer. Another thing to mention is Marvin Minsky, who of course is well known as one of the founders of artificial intelligence. His thesis was called Neural Nets and the Brain Model Problem, and it was a physical realization of a reinforcement learning neural network. And the basic components were not neuron-like units, but were synaptic, synapse-like units that he called SNARCs, for stochastic neural analog reinforcement calculators. And the stochasticity was there again to do the search. This is explained quite a bit in a famous paper he wrote that appeared in 1961, Steps Toward Artificial Intelligence. And this, of course, we pored over this when we were beginning this research. And one of the key things he talks about is what he called credit assignment, getting training information to the right places or at the right times. And so credit assignment still is a key problem for all these kinds of systems. And the eligibility idea is actually key to doing credit assignment in the kind of reinforcement learning algorithms that we were studying. I just mentioned this quickly. There was a later paper by Farley and Clark, only it's Clark and Farley. And in this paper, they use the same network, but they train it with supervised learning. They were interested in generalization and didn't do reinforcement learning, but did supervised learning. And to me, this demarks the departure of this earlier work from reinforcement learning to supervised learning. After this, I think, with some exceptions, work in machine learning was basically focused on supervised learning. So, for example, I can't see the bottom of my slide. This is Rosenblatt, who developed the perceptron, and it was strictly supervised. Although in his book, he talks about, oh, maybe someday it would be nice to do what we would now call reinforcement learning, but he never, he died young, unfortunately, and he never was able to do that. So this is Frank Rosenblatt at Cornell. And I just want to mention someone else, a Soviet mathematician, physicist, engineer, and inventor named Setlin. In the early 60s, a book of his was published posthumously. He died young, unfortunately, called Automation Theory and Modeling of Biological Systems. And this was truly a reinforcement learning, a stochastic reinforcement learning system. And I mention it because he was quite interested in what we would now call collective behavior, teams and games of learning automata, which I think is very important from a biological point of view. A team of reinforcement learning units would be a collection of these units. The collective action is sent to the critic, which broadcasts a reward signals, the same signal to all of the team members. And to be contrasted with a game situation where the critic gives a possibly different reward signal to each of the elements of the collection. And so Setlin was very interested in teams and games. And in fact, this is still an important aspect of machine learning. And I'll say a bit more about this with regard to neuroscience. But Setlin was studying stochastic reinforcement learning systems And his work is quite interesting. And I finally want to, is this the end? Not quite, but Samuel's checkers player was a landmark in artificial intelligence. In the late 50s and early 60s, he developed a checkers player system that learned through reinforcement learning to play reasonably good checkers. I think it was able to defeat him and possibly better players. But it was explicitly a reinforcement learning system, and many of his ideas have been incorporated into modern reinforcement learning systems. In particular, one of the things he did was that he attempted to develop a evaluation function that assigned to each board configuration the probability of winning or losing starting from that configuration over the course of an entire game. And this idea of creating a value for states of a system that reflect future behavior is really a key idea of what became known as what Bellman called dynamic programming, which is used in optimal control. So the connection between reinforcement learning and dynamic programming has actually yielded very interesting insights into the problems of dealing with temporally extended behavior. So I wanted to mention this connection to dynamic programming. Now, and in fact, related to this is my co-winner of this Turing Award, Rich Sutton. And I was his advisor. He was my first graduate student. And he developed what became known as temporal difference algorithms. And basically, it's a supervised system. It's an error correction system, but the error includes additional terms. So the error shown here as delta sub t is the current primary reward, if there is one, and then the current estimate minus an old estimate. So it's really learning on the basis of comparing earlier and later estimates of future reward. And if this process converges, which it does under known conditions, the value will converge to the sum or the return. If there's a discount, I left the discount factor out, but it's a way of estimating the return of a way of behaving, of a policy for behaving. And this turns out to be really critical for many, many applications. In particular, we at some point decided to try to illustrate some of these ideas, and we discovered this earlier paper by Donald Mickey and Roger Chambers from '68. And they devised a system to deal with the classic control problems of balancing a pole that's hinged to a movable cart. And how they built this system was the state space, which consists of the angle and angular velocity of the pole. They divided the state space into boxes, hence the name of their system, which they called boxes. And in each box, they placed a so-called daemon. And the daemon would keep track of the length of time the pole balanced after that box was visited. So each daemon kept a particular score about the behavior after the action it specified was implemented by the system. And this kind of worked, but we were motivated actually to say, we can do this better, I think, because their system was deterministic. We were dealing with a search process that was driven by stochasticity and developed this other example of pole balancing. And the control system consisted of a decoder, which basically did the dividing the state space into the boxes, the same as Mickey and Chambers had. But the output went to two neuron-like units. One, let's see, I think I specify this better here. One, the ACA we call an adaptive critic element, and it implemented a TD algorithm. And then the ASC, or associative search, implemented a kind of a law of effect. And so these two together constituted the controller, aside from the decoders splitting the state space up into boxes. And this was able to learn to balance the pole quite effectively. And I should say that the only difference, we cast these as neuron-like units, and the only difference between them was the eligibility was contingent on the case of the search element and non-contingent in the case of the adaptive critic. Otherwise, the learning rules were essentially the same. So, and relabeling some of these things according to better understanding, instead of calling that reinforcement, whoops, it was basically the reward, and the internal signal, the TD error, was the reinforcement learning for the ASE. And one of the points of this paper, which is kind of submerged in a lot of the details, is that this was done with two neuron-like units. And so we argued that neurons could very well be much more sophisticated computational devices than logic units, which was kind of the prevalent view at that time. So this actually was one of our most cited papers, despite a critical error that we made, where when we published it, we had the sign of gravity reversed. We implemented it correctly, but when it appeared in print, the sign of gravity, so the pole was hanging down according to that. And when people re-implemented this, I received a message from someone saying, our system balanced it in one step because they followed our equation with the erroneous sign for gravity. So that was unfortunate. But anyway, this was a kind of our attempt to illustrate some of these ideas, both the critic, adaptive critic, which was a system that learned to predict long-term reward or return, and a reinforcement learning unit that actually generated control signals to the cart pole system. Okay. Now, let's see, I need to look at the time. Okay, a little bit of time left. So Wolfram Schultz is a well-known neurophysiologist now at the University of Cambridge. And he did a lot of study of dopamine signals and trying to explore what these signals might be, what is being signaled by dopamine. Dopamine was known to play a role in reward and the feeling of pleasure and so on. And so by looking at the behavior of dopamine neurons, could some understanding be achieved. So he did recordings from dopamine neurons in awake behaving monkeys. And the example of the kind of thing he was observing, which was very puzzling at first, is shown by this picture from one of Schultz's paper. But the top collection showing a number of different trials when the reward was a raisin, or I forget exactly what he was using as a reward, but there would be a collection of spikes occurring shortly after the reward was delivered. So in some sense, these neurons were signaling that a reward has just been received. Now, if he preceded the reward by some sort of trigger signal, then over multiple trials, the activity of the neurons would move to the occurrence of the trigger and be removed from the occurrence of the reward. So it was as if the dopamine neurons were tuning into predictors of reward. And then if that was preceded by an even earlier, in this case, an instruction, then the signaling would move backward in time to follow the trigger rather than, or follow the instruction rather than the trigger or the reward. And so this type of behavior was puzzling, but those of us who knew about temporal difference algorithms, I hear some noises behind me. I don't know what's going on, but so in particular, Schultz and Peter Dayan and Reed Montague wrote a paper in Science where they put forward this reward prediction error hypothesis. That the phasic activity of mesencephalic dopamine neurons signals an error between an old and a new estimate of expected future reward. So this basically shows the TD update from Sutton's TD algorithm, but related it to the activity of dopamine neurons. And so according to this, the activity of dopamine neurons is not the reward. It's an error. It's a reward prediction error. And so this hypothesis has withstood additional work. I'm not up to date on the latest, but there's been a dialectic over the years with people saying, well, this supports this hypothesis, and other experimenters would say, well, no, it doesn't. But it goes back and has gone back and forth. I don't know the latest, but it has been very influential in neuroscience about helping to understand what dopamine is doing in mammalian brains. So this connection is very striking, that Schultz's results could be accounted for by an algorithm, class of algorithms that was put forward purely for computational reasons before Schultz's data existed. So this connection was quite striking, and to me, very, very exciting. I was, thought this is a great confluence that rekindled my interest in reinforcement learning. Okay, so looking at some data, and these are relatively early or old papers, but this paper by Yagashita and others talks about a time window for dopamine actions on the plasticity of dendritic spines. And this is like eligibility, peaking at about 600 milliseconds. Clough actually said, well, it's kind of like 500 milliseconds because these interstimulus intervals from various conditioning experiments suggest 500 milliseconds is a critical time period between stimuli. So this shows that something like eligibility is actually present. And then other work talks about evidence for a neural law of effect. This is a Science paper from 2018, and the authors attempt to show that something like the law of effect is implemented, and I forget the particular neurons they're looking at, but this idea is nice. connection to the basic idea that Harry Clough had many years before. So again, these types of results, and there may be much newer results that I'm not familiar with. So let me end by just pointing out that RL has a unique property, as I've tried to illustrate with this system. Whatever is generating the signals that are input to the critic, it really doesn't matter what it is. The critic can evaluate the global behavior and feed this signal back to the RL system, and then it can, through this stochastic search, can adjust the output of the RL system to improve the score given by the critic without knowing what's going on in this whole process. And so this leads one to consider, for example, deep or multi-layer neural networks where there are hidden units. I mean, one of the challenges is to train the hidden units in a deep neural network. And of course, the error backpropagation algorithm, which is used widely, does this by backpropagating error signals. And but you can also do this with reinforcement learning, as I showed along with Michael Jordan in a 87 paper called Gradient Following Without Backpropagation. And what we did was broadcast a reward signal to all the units of the network. And a number of papers were produced with this idea. So it's a team, treating the neural network as a team and using reinforcement learning. So this actually works, but it's very slow. And sometimes it's been called the naive method because it's simple, but very slow. And so it's not used in computational systems because it is very slow. But from a biological point of view, it's, to me, much more plausible as for what may actually be happening in the nervous system. I mean, if you look, this shows dendritic, no, this is an axonal arborization of two neurons, dopamine producing neurons. It shows the axon branching like crazy to make synapses among a huge number of postsynaptic cells. And this suggests, and certainly looks consistent with the idea of broadcasting the reward error signal, which we think of as a reinforcement signal, to places where synaptic changes can take place under the influence of this signal. Okay, now other topics which I can't get to. All of what I've talked about is we call model-free reinforcement learning. So classical conditioning, instrumental conditioning are model-free, whereas model-based RL deals with so-called cognitive models, planning, reasoning, problem solving, working memory. So there's a lot of reinforcement learning research that couples these model-free algorithms with internal models to do, for example, to do search vicariously through the model rather than in the physical world. So there's a very large collection of work in that area. Multi-agent RL, and I mentioned this collective behaviors and instances of this are games of reinforcement learning units. There's quite a bit of work along these directions. And then what are called distributional reinforcement learning, instead of being mainly concerned with the expected value, these systems develop the whole distribution that is much more informative than just a particular moment of a distribution. So there's interesting work along those lines. And then intrinsically motivated RL really deals with this idea that in animals, the reward signal is generated internally. and need not be triggered by some external stimulus, but could be triggered by an internal goal uh, and or the idea of performing some behavior for its own sake rather than for some externally observable outcome. Then others are studying computational psychology, uh, where actually I wrote this. It's computational psychiatry, looking at various disorders through the lens of some of these ideas from computational reinforcement learning. And then finally, a number of researchers are interested in the important subject of reinforcement learning safety. And I just want to end with that. I think it's very important. And if you look historically at this, um, this problem with reinforcement learning is basically an optimization process, and optimization has been used for many years in engineering, and it has, and warnings have been put forward, for example, by Norbert Wiener, who was the founder of cybernetics. And I think about 70 years ago, he wrote a book that deals with some of the problems that you can run into with reinforcement learning. It grants you what you ask for, not what you should have asked for or what you intended. Uh, Nick Bostrom, who's known as uh, a doomsayer with regard to AI, talks about this as a perverse instantiation. So key thing is that when you specify a reward signal, you don't know a priori what the system is going to come up with. And initially we thought this is really exciting. These systems actually generate solutions to problems that we didn't think of. But on the other hand, it can lead to difficulties. That's been illustrated by lots of uh, literature. Um, the the wish that gold should everything should be gold winds up turning his daughter into gold, King Midas. There's a wonderful old movie called Bedazzled that there are two movies called, but this is the early one, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. It's a hilarious take on the wishes of someone being uh, realized, but taking advantage of a loophole that creates a very unwanted situation. The monkey's paw is another example of this. So these problems have been around forever, are present with reinforcement learning. So care must be taken. But on the other hand, optimization has been extremely useful over the years as a engineering method. And, those same concerns should be followed in deploying agents that are reinforcement learning systems. Okay, let me stop and just say I have to thank my wonderful students. This shows some of them over the years. Some might be recognizable. This is Rich Sutton, the co-winner of this Turing Award. Chuck Anderson was involved in fact, his thesis, I think, was really the first case of a deep reinforcement learning system using backprop in a layered network for a reinforcement learning system. Satinder Singh is part-time, well, it's University of Michigan, but also DeepMind in London. Robbie Jacobs, Amy McGovern, wonderful students. And I don't have room for everyone, but I should say these three are now professors at the University of Massachusetts. They took over the lab that I used to co-direct. And so, work continues there. Uh, so anyway, I can't thank my students enough uh, for the development of this subject. And with that, that's the end. Yeah, thank you.